Welcome, everybody. My name is Emily Knight, and I am the manager with the LenFest Ocean Program, and want to welcome everybody to our webinar today on exploring can flexible fishing permits lessen climate stress on California fisheries. For those of you who don't know the LenFest Ocean Program, we are a grant-making program that funds ocean and coastal research projects and expert working groups to address the needs facing decision makers and stakeholders. You can learn more about us and the projects we fund at lenfestocean.org. And while you're there, you can also sign up for our newsletter. And if you're on Twitter, be sure to follow us at lenfestocean. In fact, we will be live tweeting this webinar on the hashtag LOPwebinar, so feel free to use it and engage with us there. We are really excited today to have Dr. James Sanchirico from UC Davis, Dr. Matt Reimer, also from UC Davis, Anthony Rodgers from California Ocean Science Trust, and Jessica Kauzer from California Ocean Science Trust. They will be sharing details of a new project that recently got started in the fall of 2020 to explore whether flexible fishing permits can be a viable tool in lessening climate stress on California fisheries. I will let the project team really get into the details, but part of the reason we at LenFest were really interested to fund this work is that the notion of flexible fishing permits often comes up in the context of confronting climate and fisheries, particularly the increased chances of extreme and unexpected disruptions such as marine heat waves, sudden distribution shifts, and domoic acid outbreaks. But there is a need to better understand, first, whether or not that is actually the case, and if so, what are the design options and their associated pros and cons, and what fisheries may or may not even benefit. So, there's also a critical need to understand how they could also be integrated into existing fisheries management, including conservation and sustainability goals. So there's a lot to explore here. We believe this project will help managers, policymakers, and stakeholders explore those many questions and have a more informed dialogue about future solutions. I also want to highlight that this is what we call a launch webinar, where we are having the research team present at the beginning of the research versus towards the end when there are actual results. And our goal with that is to begin the conversation with all of you, with the different managers, stakeholders that are out there that might want to engage with the research team throughout the life of the project. So that's why we do these at the beginning. This project is also part of a wider portfolio of projects aimed at filling in different information gaps and science needs related to climate and fisheries. In fact, on Friday at 1 p.m., we will be hosting another webinar kicking off our Species on the Move webinar series, which will feature projects that emerged from the LenFest 2019 Ideas Lab on identifying research priorities related to shifting marine species. If you are interested to learn more about this or any of our climate and fisheries projects, do not hesitate to reach out. We are happy to fill you in. You can see my email up on the screen before you. So before we get started, I wanted to share just a few webinar logistics. With so many people in attendance, we ask all attendees to please be muted to prevent any feedback or echoes. There will be time at the end for questions. And so we ask you, please use the Q&A panel to type and submit your question at any point during the webinar today. We will keep track of the queue, and I will read it aloud at the end for the researchers to answer. And note, please try to use the Q&A panel for that. If you use chat, I will try to keep up with that, but we like to try to read them in order. And so we ask people to use the Q&A, but I will definitely look over there and read anything off chat as well. Depending on how many questions there are, we may not get to them all, but folks are always welcome to follow up with us at LenFest or with the research team. And finally, we are very committed to trying to make, the work we fund transparent and easily accessible. We are recording this webinar and we will distribute the link broadly afterwards. As the project goes on, we will continue to share information on its progress via a variety of avenues like our website, our newsletter, Twitter, and other places. I've also started a running distribution list for everyone interested in keeping up with this. If you are not on that or unsure if you are, feel free to drop me a note. Also, after you close out of the webinar, at the end, you'll be taken to a short 3-question survey. Please take a few minutes to fill that out. We will be very grateful for your feedback, specifically on outreach and how we can continue to engage. So with that, I will turn things over first to Anthony Rodgers. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to pass presenter privileges. Okay, Jess, you should be presenter and looks great. We can see it. So Anthony, if you want to get started, go ahead.
Great. Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Anthony Rodgers. I'm with California Ocean Science Trust. We're a nonprofit created by California state legislation to bridge the gap between scientific research and sound ocean management. We usually take a coordinated, multidisciplinary, multi-institutional approach to use science to accelerate progress towards a healthy and productive ocean in California. I myself have been working on fisheries and ocean policy for, can't believe I'm going to say this, almost a decade now. And I'm thrilled to be working on an exciting project like this. So next slide, please. I am going to kick us off with sort of just a broad introduction of kind of where the idea for this research came about. Next slide. So as everyone here knows, climate change is unleashing a whole host of impacts on fisheries. Here in California, concerns have been growing for a while now as more and more of these impacts have been emerging and actually affecting our fisheries. On the West Coast, so broader than just California, there's been quite an emphasis on fishing communities and sort of how to support those fishing communities as they wrestle with climate change moving forward. The Pacific Fishery Management Council, for example, has held a number of workshops on this topic. I think they have a standing committee on it. The California Fish and Game Commission has had fishing community meetings in 2016, 17, and 18, where these concerns came up a lot, which sort of, for us, culminated in 2019. OST convened a workshop in partnership with the Department of Fish and Wildlife, the Fish and Game Commission, the California Ocean Protection Council, to sort of explore the management and policy options that that the state has the ability to use to maybe address climate change and fishing communities' impacts in California. This was back in the days where you could meet in person. This picture here is a lovely shot of the back of the heads of many of the participants of the workshop. But the attendees included researchers, fishermen, nonprofits, NGOs, resource managers, both within California and outside of California. And a number of kind of key challenges were expressed through these conversations and pulling this together. One being range shifts, where fishing locations and fisheries and fish species are moving, unexpected closures, even infrastructure impacts from sea level rise and coastal inundation. We talked a little bit about non-marine related impacts, such as fires in California. But one of the big things we focused on was sort of the uncertainty and magnitude of impacts. So we weren't sure how hard things would be hit, where it would be hit, when it would be hit. None of this was really clear. Next slide, please. So we also in this workshop talked a lot about kind of what ability do we have to meet these impacts, or to what solutions are there that might help. Because we talked a lot about there are very few safety nets that leave a lot of communities vulnerable to climate-driven impacts. So again, people that have worked in this space won't be surprised by some of the options that are up here, including community-owned opportunities, potentially emerging opportunities like, when new fish species move into California waters, insurance schemes. But one of the things that was talked about the most was flexibility. And in particular, if fishing permits could be a mechanism for flexibility. Next slide, please. So, flexibility means something totally different to different people. And for the purposes here, we've just been sort of loosely saying flexible fishing permits are kind of defined as a system of policies that could provide fishermen with greater flexibility to respond to unanticipated pressures and events. So, an easy example to point to, certainly not the be-all end-all, is you could provide different access to different fish species during an event. You could allow fishing to happen in different time and space if there's an unexpected closure or a problem, or whatever it is. But next slide, please. We realized that really a deeper exploration of this question was needed, and this is where this project came from, because it's very complicated. Every fishery is going to have different needs. It's going to have different limitations and constraints based on everything from regulations, existing management, existing markets, real, on the ground infrastructure. Like, you can't, for example, suggest, oh, well, we'll just move the fishery north if there's no processing infrastructure up there. It just, there's all kinds of elements that matter to the way each fishery operates. There are also different policy goals. And, I also say here, like, you could, thinking about protecting ecosystem integrity and health, one of California's primary policy goals is good stewardship of our marine resources. So you aren't going to introduce flexibility that might, ruin that, but you also need to acknowledge that for some fisheries, things are working and things are fine. And so you don't want to fix what isn't broken. And so again, what we mean by flexibility is going to be very, very specific. And again, there's another question about, I've been saying fisheries a lot, but we also care about fishing communities. And are those two things, they seem related, but there might be policies that could, in theory, help fishing communities weather these storms that are different from, a particular fisheries operator, for example. So with that, I'm going to throw the baton over to Jim so that he can talk about, now that we've sort of realized this tangle of, like, there's a million different things to consider here, what this research project is and how we're going to go about that.
Thank you, Anthony. So I'm Jim Sanchirico, and I'm working with Matt Reimer. Matt's on the phone. Matt, can you just say hello quick?
Hi, everyone.
All right, Matt's up north on the pass and in some snow, so he's not here on the internet today, but hopefully he'll be able to participate in the question and answer. There's also two other people on our team at UC Davis I want to point out, Kate Thompson and Junjun Dong. Both, Kate is an undergrad working with us, and Junjun is a PhD student in the Ag and Resource Economics Department. So Anthony did a great job sort of setting up our research and but let me give you maybe a little bit more in-depth discussion here. So you can change the slide. So overarching our three sort of main goals are, to think about this idea of flexibility in the design of the permits and how you define them, as a way of addressing, as Anthony said, these short run sort of unanticipated events. So the warm blob, or maybe it's a rain shift that's temporary, not permanent. And we're going to do that by going out and thinking of, and not thinking, but looking at and doing research on how is these sort of events being incorporated in fishery management around the world, and using that as a way to say, okay, what are other people doing? How well is that working? What are some of the benefits and costs that they're finding by implementing different kinds of approaches? And that sort of leads to then to the second goal, which is really, once we come up with sort of this menu or topology of different permit system designs, we're going to begin to evaluate the different trade-offs associated with them. And then finally, bring this back down into California and say, you know, what have we learned from around the world in terms of how they're addressing it? How might that apply to our system here in California? And provide, you know, a set of different options, and again, walk through the different kinds of trade-offs. We're not going to come with one idea and say this is the idea that California should move forward with. We're going to spell out sort of a menu of the different options and what are those different trade-offs. Okay, so can you change the slide, please? Sure. So the specific two high-level questions are, you know, how can flexible permits be structured to mitigate both financial and community hardship from unpredictable events? As Anthony said, at the same time, this idea of flexibility sometimes invokes people thinking that conservation objectives will not be met, or maybe they will be second fiddle to this idea of flexibility. And that's not what we're thinking here. We're thinking about how to design a system subject to meeting those conservation objectives. So introduce flexibility subject to that. And then the second question is, you know, how does the performance of different types of flexible permits depend on the kind of unpredictable events? So is there different ways of thinking about designing a system that's really good for addressing temperature changes like the warm blob off of California versus a temporary rain shift, and thinking about the pros and cons relative to what is forecasted to happen here in California with climate change and how it might affect the communities. The little figure here just highlights something that Anthony mentioned also, this idea that there's a lot of different dimensions over which flexibility can occur. And so we could think about it across space. So that's that rain shift idea that Anthony talked about. You could think it across species. One species is, you know, unfavorable to the current climate or current oceanographic conditions. Maybe you allow some flexibility to switch over to another species. It could be throughout the season or cross years. So there's a time dimension you could think about. And you could also take a step back and think about maybe even across sectors. So, you know, for some of the fish stocks, especially here in California, there's a large recreational component and there's a large commercial component also. And the sense is, well, maybe there could be some flexibility in shifting between those allocations under certain circumstances. And again, the idea is that these are things that could be utilized to address these short-run changes. All right, next slide, please. So California is, let me put it this way. I know there's a lot of people probably from California on here. It is a very interesting set of fishery management restricted access programs. There's lots of different designs of these programs across many of the different species. So there's Dungeness crab, single target species. You know, of course, permits are only one dimension of how these fisheries are being regulated. There's species groups, so managing the nearshore finfish. There are gear, so driftnet gillnet is one example. And then there's species gear combinations like California halibut bottom trawl. So we're going to have to be thinking about what we learn, what's going on, and then how does it apply given the system that is here in California. Next slide, please. And so that leads to, so what are the questions once we start to narrow in sort of the second part of this project on thinking about California? And the first question really is about fisheries. So, you know, how can we restructure fishing access to mitigate damage to the commercial fishing sector from these unpredictable events? The second question really is here thinking about, well, how does this permit flexibility translate into stability in California fishing communities, or maybe even growth potentials? And so it's not just thinking about what happens in the fishing sector, but really taking a step back and how might that interact with the resilience of these communities along the coast. And then the third question is probably the hardest one to think about, is how can you take all these other designs and potential mechanisms and bring them into California's current fishery management system, which is, as I said, rather complex set of different rules, both between what's managed here within state, what's partnered with other states on the West Coast, and also with the federal government. Next slide. So I think I've already said most of this already. We're going to conduct this review of flexibility mechanisms in natural resource management, so much broader than even just fisheries, just to get a sense of what creative ideas are out there already. Talk about the different trade-offs. Third, we'll be thinking about, does data exist in California to actually develop an empirical model that could give us some measure of the impacts before we would do these different designs of that design? So give us a little bit more sense of, while things can go up or down, what might the actual degree or how high would things go up or down in California? To get that, we need some data to be able to estimate it, and that's also what we're exploring at the same time. And then the last thing is to, report back out to California and the broader community interested in these ideas, what we've learned sort of in the study. And throughout this, what's really neat about this project, and probably different from a lot of the stuff that I've done being an academic, is our partnership with OST and the idea of how we're integrating stakeholder and community input throughout this process. So we've already had some interviews, and we have this launch seminar, which is something new for me to do in my research projects, but it's all about trying to integrate these groups into the research, not just sort of being consumers of it at the end of a research project. Next slide. And so finally, to give you some sense of our timeline, so as Anthony said, we started in the fall of 2020. We're in the process of doing that sort of literature review, beginnings to sort of think about how to organize all the stuff that we've learned. We've had those sort of informal interviews already throughout the fall to help us understand where what people are thinking about who are engaged in these activities day to day. Throughout 2020, 21, 21, and 2022, we'll have stakeholder engagements. Hopefully we'll be back in person to be able to do that rather than online. And then the last year of the project, sort of writing it up, finalizing our assessment of whether or not there's data in California to try to develop that predictive model that could give us a sense of the magnitude of the impacts. And the idea is we'll end in 2023 with a workshop. So I think I pass it back to Anthony.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, so as Jim said, stakeholder engagement is, one of the most critical components of this project. So I'm going to walk through briefly how the research component will kind of engage with that. Next slide. So, critical to this is input and understanding kind of different needs of different users and different contexts that have come about. California has a long history of fisheries management, and there's a lot of decisions that have been made for good reason historically. And so, if you're going to talk about flexibility and how that might interact with some of those existing structures, you need to understand the context and what we've learned and what's working and what's not. So, this project will pull in and integrate input from different stakeholders. Everyone from fishing interests and fishing industry to recreational fishermen to fishing communities and tribal representatives to NGOs and other nonprofits and California policymakers. And our approach is to kind of include several major touch points throughout the project. And just reiterating here again that each fishery will be different and solutions they might need or want will also be different. So we need to, have that regular interaction to make sure that what comes out on the other end is useful and relevant. Next slide, please. So like Jim said, we've already been having some targeted stakeholder conversations, both at the project scoping stage and at start. These have been kind of informal interviews to date. We've talked to the fishing industry, such as people from the Pacific Coast Federation of Fishermen Association, California Wet Fish Producers Association. We've talked to some NGOs like Ocean Conservancy, Oceana, TNC, and of course the Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Fish and Game Commission. That we were going to have sort of a kickoff web workshop, but that was when we were designing this pre-pandemic, so that didn't quite happen. But we've sort of, I think it's actually been a good thing because we've kind of had this sort of loose continuity where we're sort of continually bringing in feedback as we start to ramp this project up. Our second major engagement, once the sort of learning and literature review of flexibility from different contexts, will be to engage stakeholders and community members to collect additional information on California-specific climate challenges, to understand stakeholder objectives around permit flexibility, and just sort of ensure continued alignment with the project. Our third engagement will be once the research team has mapped trade-offs across space, time, gear, species, etc. And we'll probably, I think, have a sort of a targeted workshop to have a subset of all those stakeholders to really flesh out and talk about permit design options and kind of take what we've learned from other contexts and academically and really kick the tires on what does this look like in California, which options are feasible or feel right or feel wrong. And then finally, we'll have a fourth and final engagement towards the end of this project where we'll convene a big public workshop to kind of bring interested folks in to discuss sort of where the research is pointing and what design options are looking like and get further feedback. And again, I'm stressing there's continuity throughout this. So this is not just, there's 4 opportunities to talk to us. Like we've already had 2 people email us and we've interviewed them because they had a lot of thoughts and input, and it was super valuable. Like those conversations were great. So more of that, and I'll talk about that in just a second. Next slide. So as I said, there's a lot of input and engagement we want from these workshops and from these interviews and all these touch points. There's again a lot of learning we can do on why things are the way they are in California and sort of how that interacts with climate impacts, which is a new thing to deal with. I also want to remember to note here for my fellow Californians in the audience today that we're also collaborating with our state partners to organize kind of a second kickoff discussion to ensure that there's an opportunity to further learn about the state's interests and priorities here, and also to provide an opportunity to hear from more California stakeholders specifically. So we'll be sending more details on that in the near future. Next slide. But on that note, we do want to hear from you, and we are after this webinar, we are going to distribute a survey to attendees as well as push it out through other means to start to engage with everyone broadly, not just California, though like we would love to hear both. But to hear who you recommend we engage with to expand our understanding of what flexibility could mean in fisheries management, how that interacts with climate challenges, how that can help fishing communities specifically, and also, just here, are there additional relevant contexts? Are there specific fisheries? Is there specific research that we should be aware of that could be useful as case studies or learning in some way? We're just putting the call out to please anything that you think would be useful in this context. We would love to hear it. So we will, like I said, distribute this after this webinar. And with that, next slide, I just want to, quickly thank the Lenfest Ocean program for their support in this work, and thank all of our partners and stakeholders that have talked to us to date. And I look forward to hearing from everybody else. And with that, I guess we can open up to questions.
Thank you, Anthony and Jim. And I'm so, Jess, if you want to unshare, I will take presenter privileges back, and we'll get into the questions. While I'm just kind of setting that up real quick, I did drop the link to the survey that Anthony mentioned into the chat. And like he said, we will also be sharing it afterwards. So let me see, find the right slides. There we go. Okay. Okay, and hold on, bring up the Q&A. So, so we already have a question here. Let me see, make sure I read it. Okay, how do you define community? In the conversation around benefiting communities by providing flexibility, I'm always curious how constituents perceive that word community. A single distribution chain could have 10 people from various locales.
Anthony, you want to take this one?
I was wondering, I was waiting to see if you'd say something.
I could say something. I actually, it's a wonderful question. It is a very hard thing to wrap our head around. It's one of these things we throw around as if there's a common definition. And so I completely agree with you. It is not a common thing. And once you start to really unpack what do you mean by community, it is a hard thing. I think that is not something that we are going to necessarily address in this project. I think we would follow NOAA's current definition. They've done a lot of work thinking about through this, their social science researchers at NOAA. And so we would basically be following their guidelines on how to think about a community. But I would push us to Anthony, and just to, when you did that workshop, what was sort of the working model that everybody had on how they thought about the community? What was your sense of that?
Well, at the time, the state was also working on this. I think it was the Fish and Game Commission was spearheading it, and I think they've kind of landed on a definition, but I don't remember if that's finalized or not. But so we would also look to that. But in that workshop, and I think sort of the spirit here, we've kept that broad on purpose, because you're right that there are value chains that a solution or a form of flexibility could potentially help with, that might not help in terms of a geographic definition of a community. And so because the idea here is to understand how that plays out and what those trade-offs are across those different dimensions, I think it's probably to the benefit to keep that a little broader, just so that you can understand how those play out. And if somebody wants to define a community a certain way, in theory, at the end of this, they will understand how how flexibility can help with their definition of community.
Cool, thank you. We have another question here. How does this work if there is a capacity goal for the resource built into the design of the limited access? How do you deal with the fact that people have paid thousands of dollars for their permits? And just for a little bit additional context, this person also provided a chat, that people have paid a lot of money for the permits, and limited access is based on the capacity goal. It's based on a capacity goal, not the resource. So, you can't upend the system without damaging existing permit holders. So do you guys have thoughts about how that could work? And we're right at the beginning, I will also say to this person here. So, we might not have, these might be some of the things that the research team and whatnot will work throughout, but I'll throw it over to the research team if they have some thoughts to share on that.
Sure. This is Jim. I can chime or at least start, and then you guys can add in. So I think it's a really important question to think through, right? And to me, understanding this really makes me think about, what are you comparing the world against? So currently, certain programs, especially in California, have values associated with those permits. But those that value is tied to the value of that fishery. So if these climate shocks are actually impacting the value of that fishery, everything else equal, those permit prices should go down over time. And so by introducing potentially flexibility for those permit holders to use it in other places actually could be a means to maintain that value, offset that decrease by adding in additional options. So it's not clear that it's always going to be the idea that, it's a zero-sum game, in the sense of that flexibility is just going to move money around. It's really thinking about, what is actually going to happen in the absence of introducing this flexibility, and then how can flexibility potentially mitigate some of that? And, we definitely would want to think about distributional questions like you're raising across fisheries. When you introduce all those dimensions of flexibility, thinking about that distributional question is quite important. So it's a great issue. It's something we're definitely thinking about. And as Emily said, we're at the beginning now, so I don't want to say how this is going to end up, but we're going to be looking at that and looking at how that has been addressed in other fisheries in other parts of the country and even in the world, and how they've designed their systems.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. And I'll just, oh, wait, is that Matt?
It was, but Anthony, go ahead and I'll just chime in after you.
Okay, I'll just say quickly that, like I said somewhere in my word salad of a presentation, that you don't necessarily want to fix what isn't broken. So if there are fisheries where that doesn't seem to be, where flexibility could impact that in a negative way, it's good to know that, because right now you can't really have this conversation because you don't know what kind of flexibility or what problems it might solve or how that might play out through the system. So this will help inform that, so you can also, if one of your goals is to not erode the value of current people that have bought expensive permits, if that is one of your objectives, then this should help you do that in a more informed way.
Yeah, this is Matt, and I'm just, I echo both Jim and Anthony and what they said. The last thing I would just say is that the question really highlights one of the biggest challenges of this project. So, it's easy to design, well, relatively easy to come up with some theoretical ways in which we could actually design permits to address this flexibility and being able to address the short-run climate-based shocks, but then implementing it into not a clean slate, but into a management system, that has a lot of, built-in inertia to it, is a whole nother issue. And so I think the challenge for us is going to be able to take some of the theoretical kind of things that we learn in the first stage of the project, and then actually move beyond just, thinking about how we could put it into a blank slate, but actually put it into a real management system is a really big challenge. So I think the question is a really good one.
Great, thank you. And we have, I also want to acknowledge that after that question responded, that it doesn't think it quite works that way. So maybe, you want to follow up with us and provide some of this feedback in the survey. Okay, so I want to go on to the next question. Oops, my screen just went weird. Come on, Q&A. Let me see if I can see it here. Sorry, my screen just did a weird thing.
Well, while you're doing
Um,
that, I just want to note on that last point. This question has come up in quite a few of the pre-interviews we've done already, and it is a much easier thing to talk about in a conversation, understand where someone's coming from, and so you can respond a little more specifically. So definitely fill out that survey and let us know, because we'd love to chat.
Yeah, thanks for that, Anthony. And yeah, these are tough issues. And we have another question here. Can you give some specific examples of what a flexible permit may be? And I actually want to tack on to this question. And if you guys, I know you're just getting started now, but if also in the course of some of the literature review work you've been doing, if you found, other examples of places that are exploring these questions in a similar way, or if there are other, if you found any kind of context for that. So yeah.
I guess I'll start again, and then Matt or Anthony chime in. So, you have to, these permits are often defined as a species area combination. So really thinking about this is getting back to how is that permit defined? How does it provide access to the fishery? Which, another question we could be talking about is what is a fishery? But I think we'll use the lessons from how the permits are. So often permits are tied to areas. And so one question is that what about allowing that permit to be used in other areas? Or allowing, again, thinking of this as not a long run shift, but really, let's say you have a trigger being oceanic conditions, so temperature. Temperature hits a trigger. And so given that trigger, now for the next 3 months, a permit in the north part of the state could be used in the southern part of the state, or vice versa, right? That's a way of thinking about how you could introduce this short run flexibility. And then once those oceanic temperature or that temperature went back, right, you would go back to the current set of rules. So there are lots of examples of how programs build in this kind of flexibility. There are examples of programs where species can be traded into other species. Again, subject to not violating conservation objectives, so TACs in some of these fisheries. You can convert one species into the other. Sometimes it's one-to-one, sometimes it's sophisticated. Sometimes you design a permit by what's called a basket, so a basket of species rather than a particular species. That itself introduces flexibility into the system, because now you can harvest in the basket, and so maybe certain years some species in that basket are doing better than others. So there's a lot of different examples. The question, is thinking about how they address this short run. Now, when often they've been done in other places, they weren't with this idea of a short run sort of change. It was, this is how we were going to design the system. And now we're trying to think about, okay, how do we take what we getting predicted in terms of climate and climate events, and how could we design it based on those kinds of triggers? So like I said, you could think about temperature being one, where it hits a threshold and then you get to implement it. Sort of like what they do with index insurance in agriculture, where it's really based on environmental conditions and whether or not that insurance, rather than an insurance mechanism at the farm, for example.
This is Matt. I just wanted to follow up with what Jim was talking about. So Jim and a lot of what we've talked about today has thought about what flexibility could look like within a permit for a fishery. But another thing that we are also thinking about is flexibility between permits or between fisheries. And so, there's lots of examples where permits are, tradable. permanently, or they are leasable as well, where you could, you know, on a short-term basis, lease a permit to access a fishery in response to something that happened in the initial fishery that you were permitted in. And of course, we all know that these tradable permits and leasable permits all have pros and cons, but these are still things that we're going to consider within the realm of what it means to have flexibility in our permit systems.
Thank you. Yeah, we have another question here. I realize you're focused on short-term events, but I'm curious how you see the results being relevant or not to long-term climate change.
Okay, I waited longer and I'm still the first one to go.
You established yourself as going first now.
So I think, you know, the first part of our project is really thinking about how has this been designed in systems, whether it's within species, across species. And so understanding that, of course, those systems weren't designed for these short runs necessarily. And so that could give us insights into that question. And then, you know, I think, you know, that what we'll find, so generally, yes, but then we're going to get into, you know, the pros and cons relative to these short run shocks. And so there we'll diverge a little bit, and we really will be thinking about how they could be used and designed in a way to address it. Is that a stepping stone to the long run changes? I think it sort of depends on what we're talking about. If it's a temporary rain shift based on temperature changes in an area, and then those temperature changes become more permanent, so the rain shift becomes more permanent, I think we'll learn a lot along that way. But it sort of maybe depends on what is the actual short run shock that we're considering, how well that would map into sort of a long run change. There's a lot of hedging in that answer because I'm not quite sure yet, I guess is the answer.
Great, thank you. We have another question here. Do you anticipate variability in which sectors of the fleet can leverage access to flexible fishing permits? For example, will boats of a certain size or type be able to utilize a wider array of permit types than boats of another size or type?
So I think that's yes. I mean, I think we're going to have to think about the distributional effects. And I guess this question is really thinking about distribution using boat size as a measure of that, which is often done in fisheries, right? We talk about small boat fleet versus the large. And I think we'll be thinking about that. And that's really where, as Matt said, the rubber is going to meet the road when we think about California. And we start thinking about the characteristics of the ports, the kinds of fisheries in the different ports in California, and how do these flexibility mechanisms impact them? You know, there's been lots of work done, for example, on some of the restricted access and catch share programs in Alaska, and how do you protect remote fishing villages so that, you know, all that quota didn't get traded out and sent somewhere else. And the halibut program in Alaska put a lot of rules on who can trade with whom and develop community development programs to really ensure that those more remote villages maintained access to the fisheries. And I think that's something we're going to be thinking about here, is that, you know, what are the potential downsides of introducing some flexibility? Does that mean that certain ports would lose their fishing? And so we'd have to be thinking through those issues. I mean, there's a lot of really also innovative stuff going on in California right now at the fishing community level with these funds that have been popping up. And so thinking about, you know, communities holding permits, allowing that and these funds is one potential mechanism. I'm not saying it's the silver bullet, but it's an idea out there. And so, you know, that again gets at how do you define the permit? What are the rules with regards to having it? Do you have to fish it? the person who owns it? Can they lease it out? Can a community fund own some permits and then let them out, lease them out? These are all things we're going to be thinking about in the research itself.
Great. And we have another question here. I don't think fishermen will automatically fish new species. If they have that new ability on a permit, there is a learning curve that comes with new gear, new markets, and new fishing areas. How are you taking that into account?
Jim, I can take this one first. I mean, I think you've highlighted a specific issue where, like, answering that question is really going to boil down to what fisheries we are considering. So there's not going to be one be-all and end-all sort of design for flexible permits. So I think we can actually identify some fisheries and where it is possible to catch multiple species, whereas there are some fisheries where you would never expect them to move to a new fishery or to a new species. And so I think this is just part of the process of trying to think about permits within the specific context of the fisheries, and in this case for California. So, we are considering it, but, at this point, there's not really a final answer for what that would look like. It's really going to depend on the fishery and the species under consideration.
Yeah, and if I can just add to that, like I very briefly mentioned, there are considerations like infrastructure that are in place on the ground that make what these solutions might look like feasible or not for a specific species. And markets is another great one. Like, if there isn't a market for whatever the new species are, then that's, the part of the output of this will be highlighting, if you don't have a market, if you don't have those things there, then maybe the solution isn't the right one. Or there will be other actions that need to be taken, whether by the state or by private operators, to make this work as well as it could. So, yeah.
Anthony, if I might just a lot of these questions seem to be coming from a perspective that we have this idea that flexible fishing permits is the solution. And I don't think we're starting there. I think we're starting, can it be a solution to address these things? And so a lot of these questions that you guys are asking are great, and they're questions that we have also, and that we are going to be thinking carefully about through the research. And again, trying to figure out how these things have worked in other places will give us some of those insights. And then talking with lots of people here in California, engaging with the broader community will be very valuable also in that regard, to make sure that what we're thinking, how does it align? And I guess on that note, just to come back, that the idea of this midterm sort of workshop with the community in California is really to bring some of the ideas that have been used in other places and have that conversation with people here about, okay, what's your ideas? How could this work here in California? What do you guys see as some of the benefits and costs associated with it? So we're hoping to get a lot of that feedback on some of these issues that you guys are raising in that midterm workshop.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful, because I want to look over at the chat too, which I haven't been able to look at as closely, because there are additional comments in there. And so I do want to encourage folks to fill out the survey and reach out to the research team. Given we're in the last couple minutes, I do want to read this one. Appreciate Anthony's overview of the timeline of getting stakeholder feedback, and I'm trying to think of how best to engage members of our fishing community. What can I share with them? The survey, is there a brief overview? I can say to that person, yes, I can send the link out to the web presence for this project, which also has like a downloadable 2-pager. And of course, there's also the survey, which I'll also send out. But Anthony, others, do you want to provide any additional information about that?
I mean, as I said, we'll be doing a second sort of kickoff event with the state to think about, how to get more, how to engage, make sure we've engaged with as many California specific stakeholders as possible on this, on the front end. So there'll be more information there, but also, yeah, I think the survey is a good place to start and share it as widely as you like. And also, my email is somewhere either up here or in the invite or something, but please shoot me an email if you have thoughts on how to engage and who to engage with, because we're, that part, that part's flexible. So we would, I would love to think through how best to engage, particularly at the outset of this right now, where it's kind of hard to go talk to people in person.
Okay, we have time for just a couple more questions, so I'm going to switch back over to the Q&A. There are a couple of questions about stakeholder engagement, one being a methodology question. How are you ensuring you aren't overlooking unseen or quiet stakeholders? These could be future stakeholders, those who would benefit from a future system, even though they are not involved in this one, or disadvantaged groups. Have you guys thought a little bit about how you reach out to those stakeholders?
Thought about it, yes. Come up with an answer, no. No, it is on our list of things to do now that we've kicked this off with this webinar, and like I said, when we have a state-focused kickoff, there are lots of people and resources we can reach out to help get the word out to California-specific stakeholders. Like I said, it's a bit of a challenge when you can't just go somewhere and talk to people. But we are thinking through that, and I would love any sort of advice there as well. But yes, that is a standing discussion point.
Mm-hmm. Great. And then we have, we're going to ask just two more now. And this is related to stakeholder engagement too. If Anthony, you want to say any more about interviews with fishermen, because this person is asking, during the interviews with fishermen, has the research team asked what flexibility they would like to see in their fishery? If not, will this be part of the interview and engagement process in the future?
I mean, the short answer is yes, we have asked that. I actually wonder if Jim or Matt want to talk about that at all, but we have we've even opened broadly with kind of, what challenges and needs you have, which has been a great sort of just broader discussion point to get the interview rolling. But yes, we have absolutely asked, what does flexibility mean to you? What kind of flexibility would you like to see? How do you think it might help with, the climate-driven impacts most likely to affect you and your fishery? So yes, that is absolutely on the table.
Yeah, I would just reiterate, this is Matt, just reiterate what Anthony just said, is we absolutely want to hear from fishermen engaged in fisheries about what they think flexibility means to them and what flexibility could benefit their fishery. I won't comment on how that outreach happens because that's not my expertise, but we definitely want to hear from fishermen about that, whether that's individually or as a group or however that works. We would definitely welcome that.
Great, thank you. And like we said, we're right at the last minute here. When you close out, there will be a survey on this webinar you can provide feedback to us. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to future engagement around this topic. It's a key part of the of the methodology that the researchers are pursuing. And so we expect this to be an ongoing conversation. And so, yeah, I want to thank everybody for joining us. Thank you to the research team for your presentation. And we look forward to staying in touch. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Appreciate the questions, and thanks to Lenfest and Emily.
Thanks, everybody.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Great. I'm going to close out the webinar now.